Hi, good evening, everybody. It's so good to be with all of you, and welcome, Dr. Frans Cronje, for our episode number 2 on this outlook on South Africa. And thank you so much for joining me and our community this evening.
Chief Rabbi, good evening to you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
And I think, the purpose of this evening, as we discussed a few months, and hopefully every few months we'll get together again to look at the issues of South Africa and to look at them from a rational point of view. So often when we're looking at these political and social economic issues, there's a lot of emotion in it. And I think these episodes and this series it's not about optimism or pessimism. It is simply about rational analysis and looking about what's going on. And in a certain sense, Frans, my role here is really to ask the questions I'm hearing from our community, because there's a lot of concerns out there. And I think tonight we want to look at really 4 issues tonight. One is, of course, the ongoing electricity, the power crisis in our country. Number 2 is NHI and the concerns around that. And then, of course, the South African government's relationship with Russia and the fallout from that, from an economic and a global political point of view. And then finally, to start looking at the general elections, which are going to take place next year, and some of the political trends towards that. So those, from what I've heard, speaking to people and hearing what's going on in the community, those are the issues which are top of mind. And let's dive right in and look at this question of the electricity crisis and the power crisis. Where are we holding on this at the moment? There's been a bit of respite lately. What's the context here, and maybe what's the prognosis, and in a certain sense the diagnosis of the problem. Love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, it's looking a bit better, and for the past, let's say, 3 weeks or so, South Africa's been averaging load shedding within stage 2, if you average it over 24 hours. We've had days without, and we've had sort of level 3 load shedding in the evenings. And I think that's caught a lot of observers by surprise, because when we met, I think it was in March, and had the first of these conversations, the climate of opinion, popular media opinion, was still warning of a national blackout, and that stage 8 load shedding was upon us, and that catastrophe would befall us. And in that briefing, that meeting, that chat, the first of this forum, we made the point to you that wasn't assured at all, and on the contrary, it was our expectation that the extent of load shedding could be considerably reduced over the year ahead. And I think we were largely alone in making that call. And the reason we were able to do so is that through February, we had done a vast amount of work on the question of load shedding government policy. And when I say
Frans,
we...
I'm sorry to interrupt. Yes, I was about to say the we.
Yeah. When I say we, I speak to you as the chairman of a public policy group called the Social Research Foundation. It was established in South Africa about 2 years ago. It's a small but extremely well-resourced operation. And its initial purpose, still its chief purpose, is to provide very high quality information on the country to people who will make decisions that will be instrumental in determining the country's future. So Social Research Foundation reports are sent to, for example, the leaders of all the country's political parties, senior leaders in business, the editors of major publications, and the diplomats that represent South Africa's trade partners around the world. And a lot of that initially, as the great focus, we're going to get into that this evening again, is the election next year and what happens. I've done a lot of political polling work, which hasn't been done by anyone else, so we can actually get a fact-based kind of grounding to the political discussion. And in all the heat and angst of load shedding, we did a similar exercise on Eskom, proper deep dive, hard research project that sought to understand what generating capacity is available to the country, What is the grid capacity looking like? What are the various energy options South Africa could entertain to get out of load shedding? How have those been applied in the rest of the world? We spoke to experts all over the place. We spoke to insiders within Eskom, often on ground of anonymity. And the further we went into that work, the more, and it extended past our chat in March. We, in fact, only published our final recommendations a few weeks ago. And what began to astonish me in drafting it, and a colleague who worked closely on it, is the more we did of this, the more we couldn't understand why there was load shedding at all. Because we encountered very early on that South Africa has vast quantities of generating capacity, power stations, a significant proportion of which were lying idle. And many of those sat in the country's coal fleet. And in total, South Africa has a coal fleet that could produce, and in theory, at nameplate capacity, 45,000 megawatts of electricity. But in fact, in February, when we did our baseline data, of that 45 was producing only 17. And we looked closely into what government was doing on energy policy, and it was pursuing very strongly and with some merit policy of decommissioning coal, letting the coal fleet run down, and seeking to replace the lost capacity with wind power and solar power in the main, both of which have their merits when used in the right manner. But it also quickly became apparent to us that this was a futile exercise, and that at this point in time, our later recommendations were different. South Africa could not use wind and solar power to fill the demand gap that was necessary first to end load shedding. And then again, and this is, once you get past load shedding, there's a new priority, which is to generate enough electricity to again enable a high level of economic growth, so we can get out of the unemployment, inequality, and poverty problems that are such a risk to our future. And one of the, when I say when we felt the solar and wind options couldn't do that, there were hard, firm reasons for that. One of which was simple question of grid capacity. That a lot of the South African electrical grid was designed to transport energy from the north of the country to the south, from the coal fields of Mpumalanga into the urban heartlands. And running from the west, where there's the highest levels of solar radiation, to the east, there just simply wasn't any surplus grid capacity. So we saw early on that the easiest way out of load shedding would be a refitment of the country's coal fleet. This was a short-term solution. What refitment entails is going into the defunct coal plants, regardless of how old they are. Some of the oldest ones are the most solid. And doing an audit of their internal workings, the pipes, the gauges, the boilers, and all of that. Stripping out the parts that have failed or have reached the end of their useful lifespan. Ordering replacements from the original equipment manufacturers, or where these were not available, making the new parts and putting them back into operation. And a broad cross-section of people, some of it personal knowledge of Eskom plants, said to us, this will work. It's a 3-year exercise. If you do it inefficiently, you turn it into a 5-year exercise. And you can refit a third of the coal fleet. And by doing that, you will bring back into operation we worked out about 11 to 12,000 megawatts of coal energy. Now, each 1,000 megawatts of production is one stage of load shedding. And so if you're at load shedding stage 3, you're short, you need to add 3,000 megawatts in theory to end load shedding. So we saw that coal was a shortcut to eliminate load shedding and enable a modest amount of future growth, because we've done the estimates on how much additional production needs to be added to the economy to enable what level of growth and job creation. The last piece of the puzzle was that Eskom had flirted for a time, and so had the cabinet, with the idea of decommissioning. And a marker or a flag of sorts we were looking for was signs that the government was reconsidering that strategy to decommission old coal plants, let them run down, replace them with something else. And that became increasingly evident since in the early stages of this year. The energy minister, Gwede Mantashe, had attracted a lot of flack in the press for saying a way out of load shedding is coal. And whatever we don't know that, whatever motives are assigned to him in the press, we don't have an opinion on those here. But he was correct on the facts of it. And when the new electricity minister was appointed, also ridiculed, why do we need an electricity minister, all of which is valid. But he was saying an important thing, that we should delay the decommissioning of coal and we should consider refitment. And we saw a clear shift in government policy. And that was enough for us to make the call in the face of a lot of opinion, which said that we were headed for much deeper stages of load shedding, that we anticipated load shedding being relieved. And we said that on this forum, we said that on other.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you. I just want to just clarify something here, just to draw it out what you're saying. Are you saying, I mean, everyone knows that a major part of what's going wrong with Eskom has been, and the corruption and the ongoing corruption, but you're saying there's another factor that's been at play here, and that has been the over-focus on alternative supplies of power other than coal.
That's very important. To be very clear, in our opinion, corruption was not the primary reason for load shedding. The primary reason for the depth of load shedding was a far too rapid exit from coal. And when that was reversed, and has now begun to be reversed, the load shedding levels have been much relieved. The corruption was a contributing factor, and a very important contributing factor, but it was not the primary factor behind load shedding, and therefore load shedding has been addressed, even though corruption in the state broadly and certainly around energy production still remains prevalent. So we made the call on that. We've subsequent to that published a detailed report that was shared with the government before it was published. It was shared with the leaders of political parties and the like as well for them to consider. And a criticism I'm sure we would attract is that we are dinosaurs and we are investing in a old and toxic resource, and we are missing the boat on green energy, which should be the focus of the South African government. And our answer to that, we haven't actually faced this much because lights are on again. It's very hard to be critical of our advice to government. When the people really value the lights being on, we've realized it doesn't matter the cost. Our answer to that criticism would be, if we faced it, that it's a mistake to be dogmatic about South Africa's energy choices. It makes a great deal of sense to transition the South African economy out of coal, regardless of your stance on climate. Coal is a polluting, toxic a process that pumps all sorts of carcinogens and other toxic fumes into the air and does great damage to people and the environment. That's true. But South Africa has a second environment, which is one in which 50% of young people, more than that, do not have a job. And if that is not addressed very speedily, we run the risk of popular sentiment destabilizing the country's politics to a point that we risk the survival of our democracy. And if we lose the democracy, we become the kind of country that doesn't care about things like environmental concerns or air pollution. And that in our unique circumstances, and also given our history and through the apartheid era and preceding decades of colonial rule, it would be morally the correct choice to do what we can in the short term to again produce enough electricity to alleviate the enormous human suffering that arises from the very slow rates of growth that attach themselves to not having electricity. And also the point, which I've put to a few activists, that if you're a poor community in South Africa, you don't have electricity, you burn solid fuels in and around your home. And you're then inhaling the same kind of toxins and carcinogens and so on that coal would in any event produce. And our final advice to the South African government has been use the refitment of coal to buy the country the time to, while it transitions out of coal into a combination of nuclear and green. And the exact nature of that combination will be determined by the rate at which storage technology for green energy options improves and becomes cheaper. Because that's a real holdup on green at the moment, is you can produce a lot at peak times, but it's very difficult, very expensive to store enough to fuel your economy when the wind doesn't blow or during the night. As soon as those breakthroughs happen, and they surely will, then solar and wind options become much more attractive for South Africa. We're not dismissive of it now either. And on a small scale, households, small businesses and the like, there's a great deal that solar can do to alleviate load shedding, and it already is doing that. So our advice was, by the time, to address socioeconomic disasters, because to have a country where half young people don't have a job is a disaster and a moral crisis. Address that, and then in an ordered and planned basis, as those coal plants reach the end of their lives, which will be over the next 10 to 20 years, have the green and nuclear options in place to transition out of coal. And it is very encouraging that this is, to a great degree, what the South African government is trying to do. And it's an important story and a good one to start this evening with, because we all know and experience it. We live in communities where there's a very high degree of concern about whether South Africa can survive as an at all successful, free and open society. And these little progress we have made on load shedding, I think, is an important countervailing trend. Certainly, we're not out of the woods on load shedding either. And we could, before this winter is out, be in much deeper stages of load shedding again. That can happen. We're still at great risk. We've in fact done better in the short term than we anticipated we would. We thought it would take at least 9 months or so to get to the point that we've gotten to in 3 months. But the purpose of these conversations and what the Chief Rabbi put to me when he had this idea is let us try and cut through the angst and the uncertainty and the fear-mongering, and try and provide people who must now make decisions about their own lives in the country, their families, their kids, with high-quality, fact-based information that they can use to make rational decisions about their futures in South Africa. And the way this coal story is played out just in the first 3 months of this series, and the energy question has been a very good case study, I think, of the importance of doing exactly what the purpose of these talks are.
If I may just to just clarify what you're saying, and just to re-emphasize, and just to make sure that I understand 100%, you're in fact saying that the improvement in the load shedding schedule and the fact that it has come down in recent times is not a sort of a quirk of fate. This is actually as a direct result of a change in policy on the part of government to put more emphasis on the coal fleet, and that, in your view, the view of the SRF is the correct view for now in the country, and that it's not just didn't just happen. That this is the result of a change of direction, and that change of direction in a way is moving away from, say, the immediate ideology of the green movement, and saying, well, there's human suffering. Just to emphasize your point about the human suffering, in the meeting that I had with religious leaders and the president, at the beginning of the energy crisis, and I think I may have mentioned it on our first episode, the religious leaders said to the president, this is causing more suffering than COVID for South Africans on the ground. And it's not just that 50% unemployment rate of the youth, which of course is a very worrying number, but it is daily suffering. And so I think this This is not just a South African issue. This is kind of an emerging markets. India is facing similar issues. And I think isn't it time perhaps that the voice of kind of Africa and India and other places is heard in the kind of Western debate that's happening at the moment?
Yeah, I think the Indians have been very good on this in telling Western democracies, listen here, you developed your economies through the use of fossil fuels. There's no dispute among South African policymakers, including those who've made the turn back to coal, and within in the Indian government, as far as I can tell, that it is desirable to transition over time to cleaner energy sources, regardless of one's views on climate. Coal is toxic and polluting. But that it is not right that the wealthy Western world forces emerging markets in Africa and Asia or elsewhere, South America, to endure longer and deeper periods of socioeconomic suffering and poverty than they should in order to meet short-term green goals and ambitions. And I think that's a perfectly defensible position and a very sound position. And I also, think that, to be discreet, there are Western diplomats here in this country who are beginning to appreciate that as well. And that's stampeding South Africa into technologies that will delay the emancipation of millions of people from a life of poverty and desperation is not a stance that the Western world can morally endure. And the stronger voices like those in India and those here about the energy choices of emerging markets become, I think the better it's to be encouraged. But the critical thing, to emphasize it again, there's not a dispute about transitions to green energy. The question is simply the pace at which emerging markets introduce those transitions. And in South Africa's case, if we get that right within 20 years, which we think is perfectly feasible, we in fact concluded that within 20 years, if we do what's currently being done just from an energy perspective, we can be a high-growth emerging market, the economy of which will 2 decades from now be fueled almost entirely by clean energy sources. That's amazing in 20 years. But we've got to insist that we are given the time to do that transition in an ordered manner that doesn't compromise the living standards of poor people in South Africa or in India or anywhere else in the world where high levels of poverty and underdevelopment remain major political and social challenges.